Hi, I'm Kim Whaley. This is Simple Politics. My guest today is my colleague and friend Dan Hatcher, who's a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law with myself, and the author of his latest book called Injustice, Inc., How America's Justice System Commodifies Children and the Poor. Thank you, Dan, for coming and talking to me today.
Kim, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on your show.
Well, I just want to start, and say I'm so happy you're doing this work, but also sad that you have to do this work, because I'll just say, in so much things that I do with national politics and law, this is one of the most shocking and stunning revelations that I've seen in a really long time. And I wonder if you could just give our viewers the elevator pitch of what your research uncovered in this book.
Sure, and thank you for that. And I wish I didn't have to write the book, because I still believe in pursuing the ideal of equal and impartial justice. So what's driven me to write the book are my clients. And I've been representing low-income clients, children, and impoverished adults for over 25 years. Right. And I learned through them, and I learned through the students that I have the honor of teaching in a clinic where we represent low-income clients. And the book primarily uncovers example after example of how our very institutions of justice have started to commodify those they're supposed to serve, low-income children and the poor, in multiple ways, which we can talk in detail about. But it's justice turning itself on its head from that pursuit of equal and impartial justice to a factory, essentially using the poor to generate revenue.
So you say commodify. Can you explain what you mean by that wonky legal term for people that might not have it at their disposal in their vocabulary? What do you mean by commodify?
Sure. Well, one of the first examples I uncovered, which is both my last book, The Poverty Industry, and I also discuss in this book, are foster care agencies that are literally pursuing survivor and disability benefits from children in their care, and then taking those resources, right? Often not even telling the children. So literally taking resources from children in their care. And then the commodification happens even further with our justice institutions, where courts, prosecutors, probation departments, policing agencies are all entering contracts in various ways to literally generate revenue from the individuals they're supposed to serve with equal and impartial justice. Instead they're using them, right? One of the more striking examples are courts, juvenile courts actually contracting to generate revenue from removing children from their homes.
So let's back up a little bit and sort of do a little bit of separation of powers, government 101, you and I do in the classroom with our law students. How is the idea of the child welfare system, that objective, that whole mechanism, supposed to work ideally? I mean, we hear about horror stories on the news, child abuse, neglect, maybe the state didn't come in. I think many of us have this idea that if a child's being mistreated, the government, well-meaning government workers, will come in, assess the situation, evaluate whether the child's safe or unsafe, make a determination as to whether they should be removed from the home, maybe put them in foster care temporarily, and then try to support the family to bring the child back with one or more of the parents, and if not, to put them with a grandparent. That's my understanding of how it works. Is that incorrect as a sort of theoretical model? Is it incorrect as a practical model, or both?
Well, it's supposed to be both, right? The child welfare agencies, the sole reason they exist are supposed to be to serve and protect that welfare of vulnerable youth, right? And then the courts, when they come into play in the child welfare context, are supposed to be monitors of that mission, literally supposed to be reviewing the agency actions to make doubly sure that the agencies are true to that mission of maximizing welfare, of serving the best interests of children in their care, right? So here, that's what's so strikingly concerning is not only are the agencies shifting away from that welfare mission to generating revenue from the children, the courts, right? The courts that are actually supposed to review the agency actions, right, are doing the same thing. And it's just, it turns the mission on its head. And that's not just theoretical, right? You know, it causes severe harm in terms of what it does to pulling children from their families, right? And then making it even harder for the low-income parents, right, to strive for reunification in those circumstances. And I could talk about that more when we get into the child support side of the contractual schemes.
So the idea really is, as I articulated it, family, child safety and ultimately family reunification. And
Right.
are those objectives, Dan, established by state legislatures? Who decides, okay, in the interest of the American people, in the interest of the citizenry, this is something we, the legislature, want to foster? Because there are probably places in the world where there aren't government workers that are on the job directed by law to protect kids. So could you just lay out, before we get into where things are breaking down, who makes that decision? And in a kind of elementary way, what are the steps in theory, how that is supposed to go? Which branches of government are weigh in on here in sort of just a pure model of structure?
Right. So the agencies at the state level and at the federal level are created by statute, right? And they are part of the executive branch in this situation. The foster care agencies are part of the executive branch agency, and they are created via both state law and federal law. A lot of
Okay, so legislatures pass a law and create child welfare agency and
right.
give them authority. This authority by law, kind of almost like a police officer would to implement criminal laws. The idea is our job is to be the cop on the block to protect children from abuse and neglect, and then ultimately to rehabilitate the situation so the family can be together. Okay, so and then you mentioned the judges will come in to make a determination as that everyone is following the law. So, when you think about, we have hundreds of agencies at the federal and state level. They do all kinds of stuff. They do Social Security benefits. They manage labor and employment relationships. They deal with, securities laws at the federal level. They do consumer protection, food and drug. Agencies do all kinds of things. How are they supposed to be funded, Dan?
Right. Well, and it differs, county by county a bit, but they're supposed to be funded by the state governments and federal funds that come through so the combination of a federal funding stream for foster care agencies, for the various agencies sometimes, and then the states can use that, but all geared through the statutory framework that is supposed to be aimed towards that purpose, right, of serving the welfare of children. So you're right. If you think about a for-profit company, they exist to make a profit, right? That's why they exist, right? But these government agencies, especially in child welfare, right, they don't exist. They're not supposed to exist to make a profit, right? They're supposed to exist to serve that welfare, to maximize the best interest, the welfare, to protect vulnerable youth. So when they shift towards that profit motive, that's when the real concern and harm starts to happen.
So at the federal level, they're all different kinds of exotic agencies, but traditionally Congress, under what's called the Appropriations Clause of Article 1, Congress says, here is a chunk of money, Department of Labor. Here's a chunk of money, Federal Trade Commission. You get to have this pie to figure out in your budget how much money you want to go to fulfill your mission. And it sounds like that's not happening at the state level when it comes to funding child welfare services. Would you agree with me that if it was, here is your pot of money, here's your mission, they would just have to figure it out, and maybe we wouldn't see what we'll talk about in a minute, some of these perverse incentives to use the children to maximize their own personal benefit. Am I wrong that way? If they just have their own pie and that's it, and you just, you make your money as a government worker, and this, you try to do the best you can for the constituents, and that's that.
That's right. Well, and if you look at it just with child welfare, there are multiple funding streams, but the big one called Title 4E of the Social Security Act, which is funding coming from the federal government, right, which is supposed to go to those state agencies and is supposed to combine with state funding. It's a match grant situation, somewhat like Medicaid, right? So there's supposed to be the shared financing between the federal government and the states, with the states operating the agencies under the executive branch, under a combination of laws with federal and state, all geared towards that purpose, that crucial purpose of maximizing welfare, of serving the welfare and best interests of those children, right? And unfortunately, you're seeing these examples where those federal funding streams, instead of being solely used to serve the best interests of children, they're being tapped into as a revenue source, right? In this case, in multiple cases that I read about in the book, even the courts now tapping into that, finding contractual ways to do it.
So when we talk about sort of the funding streams, again, taxpayer dollars, here's your slice of the pie, maximize what you can do. And somewhere along the line, that's all good intended, but you discovered that there are cracks in the system where they're figuring out how to make money. And there are two places it sounds like. One is, and I wonder if you could talk about each. One is, the more kids that you bring into the system, the more money you make. So it creates an incentive to take kids out of their families. Mm-hmm. And then step two would be, once they're in the system, they can then use the fact the kids and their families are embroiled in the child welfare system to tap into those families' personal assets. So could you talk about the first one first? The idea of, there's an incentive, like make a lot of more widgets that you make, the more money you make, if you can sell a lot of widgets, if you're talking about a corporation, right? And kind of their capitalist system, it's not supposed to be that way. When you're talking about child welfare, that's really like, we only want to touch the families that really need it. How is the system, Dan, created where there's an incentive to take the kids out because there's money on the other side?
Right. Well, one of the more striking examples that I uncover in the book are how juvenile courts are actually contracting to generate revenue from this removal process, either actually removing the children from their homes or labeling them as a foster care candidate at constant risk of removal and constant processing. And what the courts do, they actually contract, the juvenile courts in Ohio and in multiple other states, they actually contract to take on the foster care agency function. They take on that executive branch function. And first they might, they put on their court hat and they adjudicate a child delinquent, right? And then they can put on their contractual foster care agency hat, remove the child from the home, possibly even placing the child in a residential treatment center operated by the court so it can pull in more revenue. And then they put their court hat back on again, rule on their own actions, right? Which obliterates the idea of separation of powers, right? And impartiality, rule on their own actions. And if they rule on themselves favorably, they can pull in more of this foster care 4E revenue, the funds that are intended to go to the foster care agencies to help children, instead being tapped into really as like a factory revenue source. And like,
where does the money go? So do they get per child under this title, this federal program, they get more money per child? It's not a fixed amount. And does that money go into these judges' personal pockets, or how does it benefit the judges to, if we assume, as you talk about conflating the foster care system with the judging, but if it doesn't affect their paycheck, why do they care?
Right. Well, the examples I've seen out of Ohio and their own annual reports, right? They put out, several of the juvenile courts put out annual reports. And when you look at these reports, they almost start to feel more like, presentations to potential investors, more so than reports about justice, right? In terms of the numbers, the amount of children that are being processed, and the amount of revenue that's being pursued. So it's money that goes into the general finances, of the courts in which the judges and other justice officials operate. And that's a complete abdication of due process and partiality. Like when you're ruling on cases that can affect how much money you bring in for your own court, the Supreme Court has repeatedly found that to be a violation of due process, right? And you don't have to be a lawyer to understand like where that's a conflict of interest in that kind of situation. Like if you are working for a business and you make decisions, right, that are supposed to be neutral, but if you make a decision in a certain way, it can pull in more money for your business. That's a conflict. So that's what's happening. And then you're right, like it's not just that they're generating revenue through these services, then, and the child removals, the training information that I found for many of the courts, and then you get into prosecutors' offices as well, they're literally using children to fund overhead, right? And if you think about like most nonprofits, if you work for a nonprofit, it's considered like too much overhead is like 15% or higher. Some of these examples that I've seen, they're generating administrative cost revenue more than 300%, right? 3 times the amount of alleged services. They're using children to, pay salaries and fringe benefits for trainings, in some states even bar dues, right, of the court officials. I've seen trainings where they talk about even using the children to pay for the cost of depreciation of courthouse buildings, right? And then one training, they even describe how you can literally claim the administrative cost of the process of claiming administrative costs through the children. So it becomes almost like a pyramid, scheme, and it sounds like the amount of money that can be pulled down.
So as the child is still in the system, then these pools, these funds of money from the federal and the state government to aid the children, they keep coming. More kids, more money.
Right.
And it sounds like, so if you're a judge, you want to make sure the lights are on, maybe that there's a water cooler. But it sounds like if they've got just a bigger pie, it can actually affect salaries. You mentioned fringe benefits. It actually could personally enhance that judge, that public servant's lifestyle by virtue of maximizing the number of kids in the system. Is that an overstatement?
I don't think so. And some of the documents that I've seen, such as out of Cuyahoga County, right, they literally draw from this foster care revenue that the courts pull in, and they kind of moved money around, but you trace it and they use that money to increase salaries court-wide and Cuyahoga County, right? So it's pulling in funding to keep this business going. It's the institution of justice shifts to becoming a business, right? And it's almost a focus on growth, right? And to have that, to keep growing the operations, to keep the operations running, to keep the lights on, you need the commodities, and the kids have become the commodities and these types of services.
So let's walk through. You use a hypothetical child, Sean, in your book, and just so people can really understand, now that we've kind of laid out what happens, let's just tell the story of Sean and walk through how the state and other players that are supposed to be helping Sean and his family are incentivized to make money off of Sean rather than make decisions that are best for his personal health and well-being. So in the book, you mentioned Sean's 12, but the average age is about 8 years old, where a child is taken from a family. What might, I know state law varies, but why might a state decide that the situation is such that Sean needs to be taken from his mother?
Well, you can imagine Sean is initially pulled into the foster care system at age 8, right? And most of the cases of where child welfare becomes involved and there's a removal are based upon allegations of neglect, right? There are both abuse and neglect proceedings, but most of the cases come in from allegations of neglect. And most of that neglect is due to circumstances of poverty, right? So you have a situation where Sean, his mother, is struggling after his father dies, and frequently there are cases where unfortunately Child Protective Services gets involved because of poverty issues. If Sean initially comes into foster care through the child welfare side, right, the agency, because Sean's father died, will realize he's eligible for survivor benefits, right, from his father. But then instead of telling Sean, the agency will pursue that money, take control of that money, and literally take the survivor benefits from Sean, right, that Sean could have not just used for having a more monetary form of assistance for himself and for his mother, for his family, right, but that connection to his deceased father, right? So they take that, and then if Sean is lucky enough to be reunified with his mother temporarily while she's struggling, the system is still going to be eyeing him as a potential source of revenue. Then, because of the trauma Sean's going through, of poverty, he's likely to be referred at some point to the juvenile justice side, often through the school to prison pipeline. And then in these contracts, right, you could have a juvenile court literally generating contractual revenue if it rules that Sean should be removed from his home, if it rules that Sean should be adjudicated delinquent and removed from his home again. then that same court may have an additional contract to pursue, now instead of foster care revenue, in addition to that foster care revenue, child support revenue from something called child support, but to pursue the impoverished mother, right, to pay back the cost of foster care that the court just ordered. And if the court does that, not only are the potential payments coming in from the low-income parent, but the court can pull down more federal revenue, Title 4D revenue from child support funds. And the courts are actually making even more revenue through that process. And then that's just the courts, right? Then the prosecutors enter into the contractual picture, and they can generate revenue from child removals, probation departments as well. Same with the policing agencies.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So for people who don't live with this every day like you, why doesn't Sean's mother just take care of Sean? And you say, listen, I mean, I've had this conversation with people, the sort of American pull yourself up by the bootstraps, hardworking, we all work hard. Like, why is it that Sean's mother, when you talk about living in poverty, why might she, as hard as she's trying, be in a situation, loves her child, that she still would meet the criteria for neglect?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a question mark of whether she would actually meet the criteria of neglect. When we look at the data across the country, there's a vast disproportionate impact based upon income and race when you look at the involvement of the child welfare system. And Sean's mother she's struggling, as we all struggle, right, to make ends meet, right? Those of us who have higher paying jobs, right, it's still difficult sometimes to make ends meet, right? So if you're very low income, right, and you're working paycheck to paycheck and dealing with barrier after barrier after barrier in which poverty brings, right? And then the very systems that are supposed to be helping, right, are instead even making it more difficult, it's almost impossible. I've worked with clients over the years, I grew up in the upper middle class in the Midwest. I had all the supports in the world, and I still struggled. I was a bit of a mess at times, if I'm being candid. I'm 100% certain if I was in Sean's shoes, right, or in his mother's shoes, I wouldn't have made it out, right? I have no idea how individuals who are struggling with poverty can overcome. And our agencies, our child welfare agencies, they're supposed to help them, right? Not punish them for poverty.
So she might be working multiple jobs. She might not have a car. She has to take the bus. The bus is late. She loses the job. She doesn't have health care. She might have another child that's disabled, or she's pregnant, or she has another family member that needs her care.
Higher, right?
She can't get child care. There's a sick day at school. She just can't do it all. And, she has to just choose between paying for rent and paying for food all of these things. I think it's easy, even, people on higher incomes, they have our moments, but I don't think we understand what it's like to be in that kind of full on stress hormone, limbic system, flight or flight all the time when you're dealing with your children. So that's her situation. Government comes in, incentivized to take Sean, because then the money starts flowing. Now, you mentioned benefits. What kinds of benefits, when you say Sean's dad died, you're talking about Social Security benefits, like a life insurance policy? What are you saying that then the state can take that you should go to Sean, but now the state takes it? How does the state get to do that? What are the benefits? Right. And how does the state get to do that?
In that instance, it would be a form of Social Security, right? That you work and pay into the system. And it's sort of like life insurance, right? When you're earning this survivor benefit for your child. Like if I, hope it doesn't happen, if I get hit by a bus, my kids would be eligible for a survivor benefit, right? So it's a property right to Sean, and money that's supposed to go to help him upon that death. So the way the states are taking it is they find out that a child within their care who's in the foster care system is eligible, either survivor benefits or disability benefits if Sean is disabled, right? They'll even pursue veterans assistance benefits if a child has a parent who died in the military, that form of survivor benefit. They apply for the benefits on the child's behalf without telling the child. Then they apply to take over control of the money of what's called a representative payee, which is a fiduciary relationship, meaning they're only supposed to then manage that money in the child's best interest. But instead, they take control of the money and use it to recover the costs of welfare for which Sean has no legal obligation to pay for. When kids come into the child welfare system, when they're pulled into the system from their families, the states are obligated to provide and pay for that services, not the kids.
So how does that happen, Dan? So we talked earlier about, okay, you've got here's your pie of taxpayer dollars. How can they, instead of using that, what, is this just a big blind spot in the law? I mean, does there need to be a law that says, listen, you can step into the shoes as a fiduciary, but like with other fiduciary obligations, we're seeing banks fail. I mean, if you're in the position of a fiduciary managing somebody's money, there are obligations on other areas of the law that if you don't make decisions for their benefit and not for yours, you can be liable in court. You can be sued. So how is it just sort of blows my mind. How is it that they can just, without telling the child, due process problem potentially, just take the kid's money?
Right. Well, most of this is happening in the dark to start with. Many of these systems are confidential, certainly to the child welfare systems. And then when the agencies are engaged in the practice, they're not notifying, Sean. So it does create a due process concern regarding notice. And I actually was involved in litigation in Maryland where we had a success on that, finding that there was a constitutional due process violation. But that's just in Maryland, right? And I've been working with advocates on legislation. So you're right, there can be legislative fixes to stop these harmful practices. That could be either through federal legislation or state. And I've been involved in efforts to do both, right? And we've had success now in moving forward on some state level legislation. So, but that's just one of the issues, unfortunately. So while, again, the agency might be pursuing Sean to take his benefits from him, his survivor benefits, then they're thinking about how to leverage Sean, right, into this sort of business operations to pull down more federal revenue. The more they process him, right, the more revenue they can draw down. And it's become just a complete inversion, of what is the intended purpose. Like, again, our courts aren't supposed to have a goal of making profit, of generating revenue. But increasingly in the research that I uncover in annual report after annual report and all these contract documents, right, and audits and the like, across the country, they're operating more and more like this factory focused on maximizing efficiency and revenue, right? It's like they're building the widgets, right, rather than serving children.
Well, you use terms in the book, revenue contractors. I mean, a revenue contractor. So there are private parties as well that have just a pure profit maximizing incentive that are brought into this. Can you explain what is a revenue contractor and how does a revenue contractor have any role in protecting children from abuse and neglect and reuniting their families?
Right. Well, the role in which they're used, and sometimes they're referred to as revenue maximization contractors as well. The role in which they're used is not about helping the children. It's about helping these institutions, the agencies, and the courts pull in more revenue to maximize that revenue. And there's examples out of the Ohio contracts that I talked about. Many of the juvenile courts in Ohio have actually contracted with a private revenue contract called Justice Benefits, Inc., right, where they help through these contracts the courts to use the children to maximize more revenue. In Maryland, I talked about an example in the book with this practice where the agency has taken resources, literally pursued and taken survivor benefits or disability benefits from children. I uncovered a contract in Maryland with a company by the name of Maximus, right? And through the contract document that the company provided to Maryland, literally referred to children as a revenue generating mechanism, right? Children, are viewed more with dollar signs, right, than they are as humans to be served.
So Sean gets in the system. The state takes Sean's survivor benefits he would have gotten from his dad. Then you mentioned, how then do we get to the point where mom is still struggling? Mom's traumatized because she's lost her son. Mom wants to get son back, still has a limited budget, still is struggling. Nothing's changed in terms of additional income. Maybe she doesn't have Sean in the house to feed. So maybe there's a slight difference. And then you mentioned that now she's got to pay the state. How does that happen? I mean, because again, we talked about earlier, the state's supposed to pay through taxpayer dollars, through the federal government and the state, for the costs of what it's costing the state to intervene for Sean's benefit. Where along the line is it mom that then has her wages and her income garnished to pay back the state? Is that in a law that lets the states do that? How does that happen?
It's in contracts, and there is some federal law that provides states with discretion, right? And that does consider that an agency could try to pursue the absent parent for the cost of care when a child is removed into foster care. But again, they're only supposed to be guided by, in all their operations, the best interests of children. So if decisions like that harm the child, harm the opportunity for reunification, right, I argue legally it's in conflict with that federal law, right? So, but what they do is they literally will pursue the poor mom to recover the cost of the foster care services, like you said, that the state is obligated to pay, while they're simultaneously taking resources from Sean to pay that same cost. I've seen examples and reports where it's possible they could literally double dip, right? They could potentially pursue Sean for that cost of care, for taking his survivor benefits, to pay, forcing him to pay for his own foster care, while simultaneously pursuing the mother to pay that same cost. And meanwhile, all Sean and his mother want to do is just be together, right? You know, they want to desperately be reunified in this process in which the agency's engaged in this really the revenue machinations, right? It's harming both of them and harming their ability to reunify. And then,
normally in this picture, the judges would come in, right? The judges would come in and say,
right,
okay, you've got this statute and it gives you discretion. You're abusing your discretion. And, you know, we're law professors. We talk about the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution. Madison famously said, ambition needs to be made to counteract ambition. They understood that it's human nature to abuse power. It's human nature. You need mechanisms to say, here's your ticket for speeding. Sometimes the speed limit doesn't make us slow down. It's the fact that we get the ticket in the mail, the next time we'll slow down. But here, it sounds like you've uncovered, okay, when they get to court and the judges are on the take as well.
right. I mean, the separation of powers and the checks and balances, like you discussed, are just so crucial, right? And the functioning of our government and the functioning of our democracy, and so crucial within that structure are courts and the independence and the impartiality of our courts. So then, you know, instead of being solely the monitors of that mission, to reviewing the agency actions to make sure they're adhering to their purpose, right, and helping rather than harming the children in their care, the courts are contractually monetized. Like the courts literally enter contracts, sometimes in Ohio, to actually take on that foster care agency role, right? So then you not only do you have the financial incentive, which violates impartiality, you have this obliteration really of what's supposed to be the separation of powers, because the courts have combined the branches. You know, and then when they rule on themselves, and they rule on themselves favorably, they can generate more revenue, right? It almost makes a mockery of the separation of powers.
Talk a little bit about how this affects children. When you
Sure.
mentioned a bit in your book that, you know, I mean, I think that again, it's a fog for people that are blessed enough to not be in this system or have children in this system. You hear horror stories of foster care, but you mentioned in your book that there's kind of a bit of a sort of a dark cloud even over where the children are going and how they're being cared for. I wonder, I mean, if you say, here's a beacon of what the objective is, take care of kids. And the idea is, okay, if you're not meeting that objective, even if we don't have every T crossed and I dotted in the law, we're going to hold you accountable. How far from that mission are we when you look at a story like Sean? What happens to Sean? And you even mentioned forced child labor in the book,
Right.
which jumps off the page. Could you just explain to our viewers how serious this is in terms of the financial incentive grinding these children down?
Right. Well, I mean, Sean, and Sean, again, he's simultaneously real and hypothetical, right? Real to the extent of children that I've represented and the data. And he's hard to write about because when I'm writing about Sean, I'm thinking about former clients. And, I know Sean and I know his mother, and Sean, he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, twice the level of veterans of war, right? Just from foster children suffer from PTSD, twice the level of veterans of war because of the trauma of removal. And then when they're in the system, children in the child welfare system are not doing well while they're in the system. And then when they try to transition out, for those who are in and then are aging out of the system, the stats are completely lined up against them. Those who are able, we'll hear a story sometime of a former foster youth who does well and goes to college, maybe in law school, right, at their foster care. Those aren't most foster children. The stats are completely lined up against them. And then not only, are they harmed in the system and harmed from the trauma of removal, they're continuously harmed from the trauma of poverty, right? And I teach with a colleague, Jess Emerson, who discusses the trauma of poverty. And one of the ways she describes it, which is striking to me, is like, what if the post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't there? What if it doesn't end, right? So for the children, the trauma that they're facing from removal and ongoing poverty often doesn't end. And because of that trauma, they're often more likely to act out, youth who are pulled into these systems, and more likely to get involved or re-involved with the juvenile justice system, often referred from the schools and the school to prison pipeline. And then more monetization happens, right? The juvenile courts are almost waiting, they have these contracts, and if they can process them, either actively removing the children to generate revenue from the removal, or labeling them as a foster care candidate with a probation officer and constant monitoring and processing, the longer they monitor and process, the more revenue they can pull down. Prosecutors are supposed to be ministers of justice, right? I mean, that's a sacrosanct role, like they're supposed to be, if they're doing the job correctly, right? Couldn't be more crucial. But I've seen contracts where prosecutors are financially incentivized through their funding equations. Children literally plugged into math equations in these contracts. And for one example, there's a contract that I saw that it uses a framework where the more poor children removed from their homes, not just all children, the more poor children removed from their homes, the more money the prosecutors could generate through the contracts. It uses something called a penetration rate, right? And what the penetration rate is literally the percentage of poor kids compared to non-poor kids who are removed from their home. Higher that
the prosecutors end up prosecuting them later for transgressions that,
or as a part of the removal. They often have contracts to take part in the foster care proceedings that can lead towards the initial removal, that can lead towards the termination of parental rights. They're also often involved at the state and county level in the child support proceedings, again, financially incentivized. Similar contracts.
Where do these kids go, Dan? I mean, when they're taken away from mom, where does Sean go?
Well, they too often don't go somewhere that's good, and many of the facilities in which children like Sean are placed, detention facilities, residential treatment centers. There are a lot of facilities now with better sounding names, residential treatment centers, camps, even academies and the like, right? But they're still detaining youth. Again, in some of the examples I look at, I uncover in the book, some of the juvenile courts in Ohio even run their own residential treatment centers, right? So they can pull down revenue, not just from this removal process and then processing the children for administrative costs, generate more revenue through detaining the children, right? That same way.
And how are those regulated? That is, do they have to have basic standards of care and safety and food and education and transportation access and health care? And if they don't, and they're run by the courts, do the courts go back to the courts to make sure that the courts are properly caring for these children when they took them away from mom on the theory that mom wasn't caring for these children? I mean, how does all that shake out?
Well, if there was a concern with the foster care agency placing agency function, right, that review would go back to the same court that's contractually taken on the foster care placing agency role. And the question, there is supposed to be some licensing and regulation of the various types of facilities. There's a lot of different types of facilities. One of the most striking things I think we have about the facilities, whether they be detention centers or residential treatment centers, is what we do know is so incredibly concerning, but it's even more concerning to me how much we don't know, right? Because how many of the operations of these facilities are again happening in the dark? Even our government-run facilities, there's not good oversight, right, or transparency into the operations. When there's an example of digging in, right, what we find is not good. And they all follow this common business model, whether it's a for-profit, huge, company that buys up, hundreds upon hundreds of these facilities across the country, and you can invest in them in the stock market, to small nonprofits, right, to religious organizations. Some of the facilities might claim a religious affiliation, and in some states that then lifts them from any licensing requirement, right, or regulation, right? So we have no idea what's happening there, right? But they all follow the same basic business model of maximizing bodies in the beds, maximizing occupancy while minimizing cost of care, a factory, right? And that business model, time and time again, it's just heartbreaking story after heartbreaking story of those stories that we know, right? Of just tremendous harm and sometimes death, that we read in the news.
That there just isn't, there aren't, it's cheaper to not have as many people on the floor, or not have as educated, trained. I mean, we see this with private prisons versus government-run prisons as well. If it's a mayonnaise sandwich, that costs less than a turkey sandwich.
Right. Well, you mentioned that. I mean, there's some even examples like out of Alabama where the sheriff's office, they're literally profiting from inmate food. They get a certain amount of money for food, and if they don't use it all, if they feed the inmates really poorly and as cheaply as possible, they literally pocket the rest. Right. So yeah, and seclusion and restraint on kids. Kids are put in seclusion to use physical restraint because it's cheaper. And they can save more money, make more money.
So this is back to Sean. Sean's living with mom. Mom's doing her best. There's an incentive to take Sean's benefits, then take money from mom, makes it harder for her to get him back because she has even fewer resources. Then Sean ends up in one of these facilities. He could end up shackled to a bed. He's traumatized. He goes to school. The school then sees this behavior. He then ends up at the criminal justice system. The prosecutors who've been involved all along are now incentivized financially to maximize keeping him in that. The courts are making money at every stage, at least in Ohio and some other states.
Across the country in a variety.
Across the country.
Yeah.
And where is it? I mentioned earlier, you said forced labor. Do the kids then, when they're in these facilities, have to work off their, room and board?
Right. Often for children pulled into the system, juveniles, I've seen examples of young as 12, children being forced to work for free, also adults, right? And that can be overseen both by the juvenile courts, sometimes with the probation department, sometimes the sheriff, sometimes a sort of a collaboration of those. And so children are forced to work for free. Sometimes it's called community service, right? In a variety of ways. And that, free labor, right, is already a revenue source. And then literally, I've seen examples, and not only are children and adults forced to work for free, they're frequently charged to work for free. So that's yet another way to pull in more revenue through the endless fines and fees through the system. So these examples that we've been talking about are in addition to just the billions in the pursuit of fines and fees against the poor.
So fines and fees to work, how does that, I can't, okay, how would someone be charged to work? Because they don't, presumably these kids don't want to be working at 12 years old.
Right. Well, whether it's a child or an adult, right? A lot of times you might have, and it could be even starting with something very simple like a misdemeanor or a traffic fine where you have a court-ordered fine, in traffic court. For low-income individuals, the fine quickly, sometimes almost immediately, balloons to multiple $1,000s with, if it's not paid immediately, late fees, interest, fees and fines on top of the initial fines and fees, right? And then the courts are generating revenue through the pursuit in collaboration often with the prosecutors' offices and the probation departments, sometimes the policing agencies as well, right? And way this works with probation is while they often are kind of pulled in sort of as the almost like a factory foot soldier in this pursuit of fines and fees, while they're pursuing that debt against someone who can't afford to pay it, they're adding more and more on top of it because they're requiring as a condition of probation more services, more fees, ankle monitoring, drug testing, classes, you name it, sometimes force-free labor where the individuals are then charged additional fees for just showing up to that free labor. And that all adds on to the debt. And then like in some of the states where I see like the probation officers will literally require as a condition of that probation, the complete payment in full of that growing debt of fines and fees that's unaffordable to the low income, whether it's a child or an adult, or their family. So it makes it in some situations, they literally can't escape, right?
It's like indentured servitude or some form of being enslaved. And I don't use that word lightly. I wonder.
There's examples in Alabama with the prosecutor's office. I've seen some of the prosecutor's offices generating up to 70% of the county prosecutor's budget solely from this pursuit of fines and fees.
Fines and fees on low income people that they know can't pay. So a couple questions that I want to sort of wrap up with. The first is, why should people care about this, Dan? I mean, I think, and I don't mean to sound callous. I mean, you hear this, it's heartbreaking. It feels, oh gosh, those poor people, maybe, I'm going to count my blessings. How does this affect everybody, whether it be through the costs of, these traumatized children in the community later, or, broader concepts of democracy? For people who are watching that are grabbed by this, how does this affect Kim? How does this affect Dan, besides that, this is your life's work, which we're all benefiting from in this moment. But why should a regular person, besides just caring, care?
Right. Well, I hope we care, right? And I think we need to care more, about each other, right? Because I do think, we're all interconnected and we're all interdependent, both upon each other and the government institutions that are intended to serve us, right? But beyond that, beyond
just ethics and values. I mean, with you 100%. But again, if that were the guiding force, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Sure. No, right. So, beyond that, I mean, when low-income individuals, children and adults are struggling and are harmed in the communities in which they live, we're all harmed, right? It creates greater instability in the communities. It creates the potential for greater illegality in the communities, right? Where individuals are sometimes almost forced into a situation where they have no choice. Right. If you're facing, unmanageable fines and fees and probation and you have no way out. Right. I talk about Sean towards the end of the book, right, where he's faced like with almost no choice between does he work with some of his friends to try to engage in the illegal sale of drugs, make some money to pay off this unmanageable debt, right, to help his mother. And if he's growing and aging and he has his own son, right, the system is now realigning its sights to target now Sean's son as a new source of revenue. Sean's going to want to help his son, right? I would, I would do whatever I could in that situation.
And Sean can't go to the child welfare people that are charged with
right.
helping Sean and his son, because he saw how that happened the first round.
Right, but it hurts.
So this affects us all in terms of safety, and then what it costs our taxpayer dollars to deal with the fallout societally from traumatizing generations of people, impoverished people, disproportionately African American. But it affects everybody.
That's right. It increases the cost for all of us for the structure of the child welfare system, of the courts, right, in terms of that are growing and processing all these systems, all these populations through the criminal justice system, right, in the juvenile justice system. And it just creates an unstable social fabric, right, that can reduce safety and well-being, right? When it's a very simple statement. When we all do better, we all do better, right? That's not really a
Right,
complicated
people,
idea.
yeah, and voters worry about crime, and they don't want their taxpayer dollars gone in the wrong places. And
Right.
those are major voting issues, and I don't know that people understand there are ways of addressing it and to satisfy your humanitarian self
Right.
in the right way. The other thing I wonder, Dan, and I do a lot of work around democracy in general and why we should care.
Right.
That we should care that people in power are held accountable.
Right.
Because once those systems break down, I personally think, and frankly, professionally think, it's a little naive to think, okay, if you've got biased, corrupt prosecutors, judges, and I say corrupt in quotes, they're not necessarily horrible people. They're caught in a system that incentivizes, greed, maximizes that. If you've got a corrupt system, eventually it's going to affect you. When you need justice, you need impartiality, you need fairness, you need due process, you need representation. You want decisions based on facts. You want a value system it's in the law to actually govern what happens for you and your family. That's not going to be there because you let it go for your neighbor.
That's right. 100% agree. And, I describe these systems in the book as our foundational systems. Are often referred to as lower level, right? The state trial courts, the family courts, the systems that predominantly serve lower income individuals, right? Or individuals in their greatest need and their greatest vulnerability. But, you think about, again, any structure, the foundations are the most important, of any structure. If the foundation is crumbling, everything above it crumbles too. And these are our justice institutions, right? If we don't have justice, if we don't have equal justice, right? If we're not, using everything we can to preserve, right, that ideal of equal and impartial justice, then democracy falls with it, right? And you see that time and time again across the country, across the world, through history, right? Democracies fall, right, when countries don't preserve the crucial, just the sacrosanct role of equal and impartial justice within that system. And what's central within that, the independence of our judiciary.
When it comes to other, sort of disenfranchised populations, people of color, people from some certain immigrant backgrounds, gender-related distinctions, the Constitution has been construed, it's either expressly or impliedly, to protect decisions or to, I should say, hold accountable government decisions on a very high level, right? So if a government makes a decision that was based on race, the courts are going to be really, really, really harsh on that. You better have a really good reason, is the idea. We call that strict scrutiny. But the notion is, okay, we as a constitutional democracy understand there are certain disenfranchised groups, there are certain minorities that have been treated badly historically, and if you don't hold government to a higher standard, that old way of doing things will just continue. Do you think that if poverty were treated that way under the Constitution, this might change? I mean, this is kind of a meta constitutional concept, but poverty it seems to me it's treated as, oh, that's your fault. That if you worked harder, it's almost like, you could fix it for yourself, rather than understanding many of us are born into an infrastructure that just doesn't challenge us in that way.
Right. Well, and despite the intended constitutional protections, the disproportionate impact of these revenue schemes that I uncover have just a vastly disproportionate impact based on race and income. But yes, like low income individuals from wherever they live of every demographic are harmed by the practices, right? And it's almost the flip, right? Instead of any greater protections, right, there are fewer protections, right? Both in terms of their potentially being almost targeted by some of these practices, and then served by systems that are less operationally true to their mission to start with, right? When the systems are instead looking towards the low-income individual as a source of revenue rather than a human being to be served with justice, right? How do you put a number on the amount of harm that comes from that? I mean, a low-income individual should have the same protections as a wealthy depositor in San Francisco, right? Out of San Francisco.
Or a corporation, right? We're seeing these banks fail, the president's stepping up, everybody's talking about it, but, banks have
Right.
lobbyists. Banks can afford
Yep.
lawyers that cost, a couple $1,000s an hour in Washington and New York and San Francisco. Dan, where
Poor
are
people
the
don't have that same voice.
yeah, where, I mean, because when you explain this as a lawyer, it's like, okay, well, you can make the case for constitutional violations even without low income, as you say, being treated as a suspect class. Think in your head, okay, there are various ways of challenging this. Look at the law and say, listen, you're not adhering to your mission under the law. Look at, I mean, I don't know, this is lawyer speak, but where are the lawyers, Dan?
Right. Well, I hope there are more who are learning about these practices, right? There are some excellent lawyers out there that are trying their best to help impoverished individuals, vulnerable populations. I was a legal aid lawyer for years, and I worked at the Children's Defense Fund, and I've worked with some superhero, advocates out there. But most low-income people on most issues, right, don't get any legal representation. On the civil side, a lot of people don't even realize that if you're poor, you don't have the right to have a lawyer given to you on these civil issues, only in criminal, only in some of the criminal issues, right? So for the vast amount of people, whether it be in evictions, right, or these collections actions, sometimes by the courts themselves, they don't have lawyers in this process, and they're horrified by it. Because sometimes, like, to challenge, they'd have to go up against sometimes the courts, the prosecutors, the probation officers, the policing, sheriffs. You're going to challenge the actions of a sheriffs. In some jurisdictions called city marshals, literally hired guns, right? So they don't have a voice, and we need to do better. So I think us in the justice system, it needs to start with us, right? As lawyers, we're officers of the court. Judges are under an ethical obligation. So are prosecutors, so are probation officers, so are policing officers. And we need to be more true individually to our ethics, right? And I do think, based upon a comment you said earlier, even if we're trying our best, even if you have a judge or a probation officer, right, a prosecutor who's trying their best to be ethically true, right, to that intended mission of equal and impartial justice, if they're operating in a system that's structurally compromised constitutionally and ethically, right, then I argue in the book, as an ethical truism, their own ethics are compromised, right? We have to look beyond just our own actions to the systems in which we work.
Yeah, I don't think it's, bad guys versus good guys. I
Right.
think we're all human. And, but you make an excellent point that I emphasize with my students, which is that people who can afford lawyers get more justice, right? I mean, this is the bail reform question that, innocent until proven guilty, the last president, there was a lot of coverage on his due process rights. Well, how many of us get a full trial before the Senate before we get fired from our job? Whereas if you're a low income person that's wrongfully arrested and you cannot make bail, you'll serve your entire criminal sentence without one day of a trial. There's your due process, and that's not protected in part because the lawyers aren't there to make that law on behalf of these people. So for people who are watching that are in law school, maybe you want to go on to a big law firm, which is great, but they all have pro bono programs. And Dan, for non-lawyers and for lawyers, are there some really basic things people can do besides just shake their heads and say, "Woo, that was a heavy, simple politics"? Like, what can regular people do, Dan, that have their busy lives and other priorities, to lend some positive energy to this really dire situation for the children of this country?
Right. Well, it starts with awareness, right? Any change, any movement towards needed positive change starts with awareness. And, your show is so crucial to that, having a platform where you're informing individuals of such crucial issues and having people on your show, that's a huge step towards that awareness, right? Because if we're going to work towards a change, some sort of fix, it needs to be the right fix, right, to start with. So individuals being aware of themselves and then sharing that awareness, sharing this show, if they obtain my book or other information that I've written or others have written, right, share that information with others to help spread the awareness and education. And, they can go further. You can have a voice with your elected officials, right? Contact your county local officials, contact your state elected officials, sometimes federal, right? And have that voice. I worked on a bill in the District of Columbia, and I had the honor to help draft the legislation, to testify, and it's now been enacted But that didn't start, actually with me. It started with an individual, read some of my prior scholarship and was, floored by it and wanted to do something about it. And we communicated. They contacted their local DC elected official, right? Suddenly you got a bill, and now it's the law in DC, right? So it can start with just one person. One person can make a huge impact.
Can you tell us before we wrap up how people can follow you? What are your handles and where we get the book, et cetera? And I know this isn't your first book. If you could talk a bit about that as well.
Sure. My last book was The Poverty Industry, which really looks more at the human service agencies that, fortunately, that's not the most uplifting topic as well, how our human service agencies are treating children and the poor as revenue tools. This book, Injustice, Inc., looks at our various systems of justice and how they've become part of that poverty industry. And I think even more concerning, people can contact me. My handle on Twitter is Poverty Law Prof, right? I have an author page on Facebook, or just Google my name, Daniel Hatcher, and I have a faculty webpage right at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where I have the honor of teaching in our clinic program, and folks will find my contact information, including my email there. And I encourage people to reach out to me if you've encountered some of these issues yourselves, or if you want to become involved, if you just want to brainstorm on how to start working towards solutions, I'd be honored to try to help.
Listen, Dan Hatcher, thank you so much for being on Simple Politics. It's really been an illuminating and wonderful conversation. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, Kim. It's an honor. I couldn't be more grateful to be on the show.
Thanks, everyone, for watching. I'm Kim Whaley.